Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Going Mental, where we talk about some of the mental health issues faced by men in this culture, particularly where it concerns their relationships. I'm Paul Elam with avoiceformen.com, and sitting with me, or not really with me, but she's down there in that little box at the bottom of my screen, is Dr. Tara Palmatier from shrinkformen.com.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk today about daddy guilt, which is a sort of coined term that many people may not be familiar with, but if you are a divorced father, I can almost promise you that you're familiar with the term guilt, or any divorced parent is. I want to talk about this for a minute just in terms of basics, because we're going to take this a couple of notches up talking about guilt and the effects of it in the aftermath of a divorce. But one of the primary feelings that people get when they divorce is guilt, a sense that they have failed in their ambition to have a successful marriage, a sense that they have, if they have children, that they failed them by the family breaking up. And even if they're angry, a sense maybe that they have failed their partner by not being the spouse that they had intended to be, or maybe they were a better spouse and it wasn't seen. You never know, but the fact of the matter is that guilt, and I mean copious amounts of it, is a byproduct of most divorces, along with anger and a lot of other feelings. But we're going to be talking today more about what happens with guilt after the divorce. But I just wanted to say first that we're not going to try to advise anybody on how to have a guilt-free divorce. I personally don't think that's possible, but where it becomes particularly toxic is when you happen to be married to somebody that is high conflict and uses kids and things like that. So let's start with that, Dr. T, and I just wanted to get your thoughts before we moved on about sort of the normal sense of guilt that people should expect to experience when they're going through a divorce.
Sure. And look, I think it's natural for both parents, mothers and fathers, to feel some degree of guilt when the marriage they make that hard decision that the marriage just isn't viable, because obviously you don't get married and start a family thinking or hoping that it's going to end in divorce, and most people want to give their children an intact family home, two parents, a mother and a father, or a mother and a mother, or a father and father, whatever your preference is. And I think a lot of parents struggle with feelings of guilt when they have to make the decision that, hey, this just isn't working out, there's too much conflict, we don't want to subject the kids to it, it's not healthy. And so I think that's a natural part of the process, and hopefully after the divorce you have a good co-parenting relationship, everybody's happier because the conflict and the tension has gone away, and you're both better parents apart than you were together. But then, as Paul, as you mentioned, there are couples in which one or both parties are high conflict or personality disordered or have some other very toxic, difficult personality issues, who will use the children as weapons and hostages to continue to hurt and punish the other parent. This is often more easily done by a custodial parent, which 80% of the time is the mother. If you divorced a woman like this, I mean, it probably, as I said, was a very difficult decision, and you worry about leaving your kids in her care and not being there as a buffer. So that's one element of guilt that a lot of fathers I work with experience, where they couldn't take it anymore, they had to get out, but they feel a tremendous sense of guilt that they weren't able to get their children out with them so that they could continue to protect them.
Yeah, well, isn't that also, in fact, the motivating factor in why so many men stay for so long to begin with? That Absolutely. Yeah. So they get guilt trips, especially from high conflict wives, that will make them feel bad for leaving, who will bring up the children card every time they talk about attorneys or anything like that, and say, you're terrible if you leave us, you're hurting your family.
Right. So the wife and the mother has already, instilled a sense of guilt even before the divorce is filed, and often will say things like, if you leave, you won't see the kids. the kids will know that you abandoned them and you don't love us anymore, because oftentimes to these women, the children and her are a package deal, and if you're not with her, you don't get to have a relationship with your children, or at least that's what she wants to have happen. So oftentimes men struggle with a tremendous amount of guilt even before they file, because they have a pretty good idea of what they're in for. And also sometimes they buy into the false belief that divorcing an abusive spouse means you're abandoning her and abandoning the children. You're not abandoning the children. You're going to be giving them two homes. And if the courts worked as they were supposed to, you would have equal time with them, and there would be no abandonment of them. So if you're not getting to see your kids as much as you would like, you did not abandon them. You're being constrained by a court that either gave you a really lousy custody deal or won't enforce its own custody orders.
And then what happens, too, often when you have somebody that has guilted you into staying for maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 additional years past the point that you would have stayed in a relationship, but you've been sort of chained to it by the guilt that's being dumped on you all the time, is that if you have children with this person, they will begin in the process of alienating them from you to send them messages. Daddy left because he didn't care. He doesn't show up to your events like he used to, when he's in fact not allowed to, because he doesn't care. And that's where the guilt starts really taking on a toxic twist, that the embittered former spouse is now taking the kids and saying, well, I can't get Dad I finally lost my grip of guilt over him, so I'm going to start transferring it through you to him, and telling you, and this, of course, damages the children terribly in the process, doesn't it, Dr. T?
Well, it does, and it also, something I see that's very common is that the children who have, been hearing their mother trash their father, they're suffering the effects of an alienation campaign. The children will often start to model their mother's behavior, where they're disrespectful and quite cruel to their fathers. And so on the one hand, fathers should absolutely not tolerate that behavior and implement appropriate discipline if your children are acting like that. But on the other hand, oftentimes when they have a mother like that, if the kids say, I don't want to go see Dad, he's being mean to me, in other words, setting appropriate boundaries and limits for my bad behavior, Mom will say, well, then you don't have to go see your father, and if your father takes me to the court, we'll tell the judge that your dad is being mean to you, or something to that effect. So fathers, if they want to see their children, are in this double bind, where if they set appropriate limits with them, if they try to teach them, hey, it's not okay to treat me that way, I'm your father, I love you, I don't treat you like that, you must not treat me like that, he runs the risk of the kid saying, well, screw you, Pops, we're going back to Mom's house, where we can do whatever we want to do.
I don't think we should underestimate how difficult that can be on fathers, too, sometimes. That they are in a
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, they're in a real jam where they get just a measured amount of time with their children. It's very, very sparse. And during that time, they want to enjoy as much of a connection with them as they can. But when the mother has begun to use the guilt of the divorce and turned her rage to act it out through the children toward the father, then he ends up contending he's actually in an argument with her through the kids after the divorce. And then he attempts to set limits. Well, at the same time, if that wasn't bad enough, we've got a whole bunch of psychotherapists out there and counseling individuals that are telling fathers that they need to become Disneyland dads and don't set any limits with them. And they will sometimes, unfortunately, follow that very, very toxic and bad advice into allowing their children to continue to act out Mom's rage and disappointment.
And rewarding them for it by taking them to Disneyland, buying them lots of toys and gifts, and giving them money. So in order to be able to see their kids, they can't discipline them so that they turn into functioning civilized adults, but they also essentially have to bribe them. So it's like they're paying off their kids to treat them like crap, just
And
so they can see them.
mother gets the message during that whole time, hey, you know what? This is working pretty good. And so she does it more. She
Or
pulls it.
worse, because here's a double bind. If that's the only way dads can get to see their kids, then she becomes resentful because the kids will want to go see him because it's like going to Pinocchio's Donkey Island, where no rules, and then oh, he's just a Disneyland dad. It's like, well, lady, what choice did you leave him?
Absolutely. And then let's take this already, if this weren't complicated enough, let's throw in one more equation here that often happens. There are some men who, after the divorce, would like to move on with a relationship life. And they frequently will partner with women who have had already children by other marriages, or they'll partner with another woman, and then he has to contend with the crazy ex acting out her rage to the children at her too, and encouraging and modeling for her children to treat everybody with the same disrespect that they're allowed to get away with. So the crazy ex begins to poison the next family, not just continue to ruin him. She's actually got a whole family that she can destroy all over again, just like the first one.
That's an excellent point, and let me add to that. Oftentimes, at least with the couples I work with, when the new wife or girlfriend enters the picture and she's healthier and not a raging lunatic, and she sees the way her husband, her boyfriend, is being treated by his own children, by the ex, she gets angry, and rightly so, because the person she loves is being treated like some hybrid of an ATM doormat punching bag. And continuing, I mean, he left the marriage because he was being abused and was miserable, and it's followed him after the divorce. It doesn't stop. So oftentimes, and because a lot of these men are so susceptible to feeling guilt that they've been manipulated to feel, and they put up with it, the first time they will hear, hey, it's not okay for your kids to talk to you like that. It's not okay for your kids to talk to me like that. And your ex-wife, it's not okay for her to treat you the way she's treating you. So for the first time, these men will hear that, and they'll start to try to set boundaries, which then, of course, means that the ex-wife is no longer able to continue to call the shots and be in control. So who gets blamed for that? The new wife or girlfriend. This is her. She's telling you to you love her more than you love her kids. This is all her. She's putting ideas into your head. It's like, yeah, bitch. She's putting ideas into his head that he should be treated with respect and civility. But so that's another way that the new wives and girlfriends get targeted, because they will encourage their husband or their boyfriend to stand up for himself and to not allow himself to be treated so poorly.
And of course, like Dr. T said, when he does, he's frequently poured on more. And when he doesn't, if he is still boundaryless and allows this kind of conduct to go on, it begins to fester between him and the new partner in their relationship. And
he feels guilt about that.
Yep. And it's so, and here's the deal, is that, health and good relationships are something that have to be like maintained, sort of like gardens, and you have to put some energy into them. Crazy breeds on its own and sort of goes everywhere, and it can get, once it gets in the water, it's difficult to get it out, but it is a very, we would call it extremely small molecule, very water soluble. It just expands and goes everywhere. And if you don't put a stop to the craziness at the source, it will continue to infect through several layers of people. It's amazing to watch this happen, is that you can have a guy find a relatively healthy new partner where they could have the possibility of enjoying a decent relationship, and 2 years down the road she's getting crazy. Not because she's really crazy, but because of the frustration and the destruction that's being brought into her life over this, and it's all goes back to the original source, and it just spreads out like evil tentacles everywhere through the children, through the relationship, and even to the into the family members and in-laws of different people. So, what is Dr. T? You know, as we know in your world, there's very seldom something that we would call the answer. I mean, it's just, sorry, life is that way. There's no magic wand. There's no pill. There's no, well, there's red pills, and they do a lot of good, but there's no magic pills for anything. But if we had to start discussing what are solutions to this, how do you stop this, where would we want to start talking? It's all goes back to the original.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I had a weird glitch.
Oh, well, I heard it come through there. Well, I was just saying that we don't have any magic pills, but if we wanted to start with talking about how do you start correcting this once it's going on,
Sure.
where would we start talking?
Yeah, that's. I wish there was. I wish there was a magic pill for that. Unfortunately, there isn't. Typically, some really, really hard, oftentimes painful decisions need to be made. You know, one, do you want to continue? Does the dad, does he want to continue to tolerate that kind of behavior from his children when his hands have been tied? You know, if the court has enabled the ex and won't enforce its own custody orders, that means if he does set limits with the children and say, hey, I love you, I'm your father, but I'm not going to tolerate this treatment, and if you continue to treat me like that, there are going to be appropriate consequences. He runs the risk of his children refusing to spend time with him, or such sporadic time that it's not going to make a bit of difference anyway. In that he won't have enough time to parent them in a different way than his ex that hopefully will foster positive growth in the kids. And some guys make this decision to where they will say, look, I love you and I want to be your dad and I want to be involved, but we need to abide by some ground rules of behavior and how you're going to treat me. So they run the very real risk of not having relationships with their children during their childhood or adolescence. Sometimes they come back around when they're adults, if and when they ever get their mother's number. And if that happens, then again, that doesn't solve the problem, because he will then feel guilt. Like, I should be trying more. I should just deal with it so I can see the kids. And sometimes then that will cause, even though I think that is the healthy choice, that will cause a rift in the new relationship where the husband will then start to resent his new partner because she has said, look, we do not want this toxicity in our house. I don't want to see you treated like that. So he becomes resentful, even though his new partner has encouraged him to stand up for himself and to insist upon being treated with respect and consideration and decency. If the kids refuse to see him, then that is often it can become a source of resentment in the relationship. And dads, even fathers I work with, who intellectually they know it's the right thing to do. They know they're not helping their kids by continuing to be their punch bag and target of blame for everything that is wrong in their world and their mother's world. It still hurts. They still feel guilty. People will come up to you and ask you, oh, how are your kids doing?
And that's got to be tough.
Talk about a lump in your throat and a knot in your gut. I mean, what do you say? My ex-wife is a callous, crazy ex-bitch who's taught the children to hate me, and I don't have a relationship with them anymore.
Well, one thing I think you don't say is, at least in my opinion, I'm going to offer a couple of things here, Dr. T, and they are normally the things that are not particularly popular with my audience. But there's nonetheless the way the way I think about these situations based on my experience seeing them over and over again. A couple of things, you know, like you said, a guy may end up resenting his wife, his current wife, because she wants some protection around the relationship. She doesn't want the toxicity in the home. I'm sorry, dude, but she's supposed to not want that stuff. And frequently, these are men who tolerated abuse when they were married, and they have carried that horrible bad habit into their new relationship, and they're continuing to tolerate abuse.
Well,
So,
and not just that. Because the ex is oftentimes just such hell on wheels, and if they manage to find themselves a healthier, stable, non-abusive partner, the consequences for thwarting the nasty ex are greater than the consequences of telling your healthy, loving, supportive partner. You know, what I'm saying is there's a higher penalty for telling the crazy ex no than telling your healthier partner no, and that's just messed up.
I think there's a higher penalty on the surface. I think that ostensibly there's a higher penalty, but I tell you, and again, I may be wrong about this because these are such complicated situations that you know, brainier people than me are going to have to figure them out. But I don't necessarily buy that the real consequence is worse if you stand up for your current relationship. Because if you're going to maintain a relationship with your kids that is built on manipulating you with guilt and that is conditional on your destroying healthy relationships that you have in your life, which every human being deserves at least a shot at trying. And I can hear all the MGTOWs saying, well, don't get in relationships. I hear you guys, but people do, so we have to deal with that. We can't just tell them, well, you should never get in a relationship so you won't have problems. But here's the deal, is that this still goes back to him. In my opinion, you've got to choose, and sometimes choosing sucks. It just sucks. But if the consequence of being with your kids means that you can't have self-respect, you can't have a chance at a good relationship in your life, that you've got to continue to bow and scrape to the will of their crazy mother just in order to spend time in the same room with them, that to me is a much greater price than not being with them.
I agree with that. And to that point, you may as well not have divorced her in the first place if you're going to let her to continue to control your life and the decisions you make. And I agree with Paul. There is a greater consequence to be paid. Maybe it doesn't seem like that in the immediate moment when you're desperate to see your children and they won't see you, but you know, your kids are going to grow up and become adults anyway and lead their own lives. That's a short window of time. But if you have a chance at a healthy, loving relationship, that's going to last a whole lot longer.
And you have a chance to have a decent relationship with yourself where your self-respect is intact. I would apply this to guys that aren't even involved with somebody else, that are off living by themselves after the divorce. I mean, what are you going to live with? I mean, I understand you feel like as a father that you're willing to do anything so that you can have a relationship with your kids. A lot of men feel that way. But anything that you're willing to sacrifice your self-respect for is tainted anyway. And if you don't face that, you've got bigger problems, even maybe than your ex.
Right, and there are guys who make the decision, and I hate to break it to them, but there's no guarantee of this. Self-respect is hard won in these situations. There are men who have made the decision, well, I'm just not going to start dating until my youngest is over 18. Parental alienation does not stop once the child technically becomes an adult. I work with men who are in their 50s and 60s who waited until their youngest was an adult in college to begin dating. And guess what?
The son or daughter hates the new girlfriend.
That is correct. And how could you do that? How could you get married Meanwhile, oftentimes their mother has remarried and gone on with her life, but dad isn't supposed to move on and have a life after his marriage to their mother.
He's
So
supposed to sit alone in a room and write checks and suffer with his mouth shut.
that's right. And show up for baptisms and marriages and graduations and stand to the side, an obedient foot servant. So at some point, if this is an issue for you, you're going to have to do the work of doing this and possibly suffer the loss of a relationship with your children. But again, like Paul said, if your relationship is contingent upon you being somebody's doormat, that's not a relationship that is as healthy or good for you to be in. And furthermore, what are you teaching your kids?
Well, yeah.
By enabling that.
You're teaching them to grow up and have relationships that are conditional on either being a doormat or having somebody that's a doormat, because they go one of those two directions in most cases. This is the toxicity is the problem. So, again, what I'm saying is that it just seems make a lot more sense to me and be a lot healthier to make all your relationships be conditional on respect. That respect it doesn't matter who it is, ex-wife, current wife, children, boss, friends, whatever, everybody in your life. If they're treating you with disrespect, if they're treating you like a doormat, that's somebody that is not supposed to be around you while they're acting that way, ever. And that seems like it's some place that for some guys is just too far to reach, that they can't imagine life with the rules set that I'm not a doormat. If you wipe your feet on me, then you have to be walking away in the process, because I'm not going to let you do it again.
Yeah.
And that's where where you sense the silence between Dr. T and I right now. That's where the line in the sand is. And as much as I've worked with people over the years, and Dr. T has even specialized in this area, this is the line that every guy's got to cross at some point or another if he's with a high conflict ex. And his new girlfriend can't do it for him, and his children can't do it for him, and his ex-wife sure as hell is not going to do it for him. But sooner or later in his life, and even if he delays dating, she's still going to continue to alienate the kids. She's still going to continue to make him suffer. He's not going to somehow live in a blessed life if he just doesn't date. She'll find other ways to make him suffer. Just saying that's a very alone place, isn't it, Dr. T, when you're staring at that line in the sand, and you've got to do something about it, and there's nothing else to do, and no matter what you do, you're going to pay a price.
That's right, and there are no easy platitudes or solutions. It could be that this is a loss you are going to suffer, and that you will have to grieve and mourn, and the kids may not come back around. Unfortunately, when you have children with someone like this, there's no way to get out entirely unscathed, in my opinion. And oftentimes, the price that you have to pay, the hobgoblin under the bridge, is the relationship with your kids.
Which you have to ask yourself, if your kids spend their whole time growing up watching you jump around like a trained monkey, like a dog jumping through hoops, or a seal balancing a beach ball on its nose, trying to get a treat, do you really think they're going to respect you? No, they're not. A lot of you guys out there that are going through this are already finding your kids talk to you like you're trash, and they'll talk to your new girlfriend that way. Why? And the answer is because you've allowed it. And that's not a pointing finger, but that's something that people have to face, is that nobody gets abuse. And I'm a firm believer in there's no victims, there's volunteers. And certainly, of course, I don't mean that stone cold literally. There are victims in life. But agreeing to abuse that you know is there is volunteerism. It's not victimhood.
That's right. Then before I lose the thought, I want to address another form of guilt that I've encountered in my work that perhaps some of you who are watching this have experienced, which is that after you make the decision to create boundaries, to enforce those boundaries, and you're no longer being subjected to the abuse and cruelty and disrespect of your kids, a lot of the guys I work with will feel initially a sense of relief. Like, okay, I put it out there, I drew the line, they don't want to see me, that hurts, but it also hurts less than having to see my kids and being treated like a piece of garbage. Then they start to feel guilty about feeling relief about not having to feel.
You're not going to win.
So they start to feel guilty about not feeling guilty, which is like a meta form of guilt, which I myself have experienced, not in regards to this, but about other issues. And I'm like, okay, why am I feeling guilty? I'm like, I know why. Because I don't feel bad about not being around a person who is obnoxious as hell. Although I should go because they're a relative. It's a family event, and I feel like I should be there. On the other hand, no, I don't have to be. And then I feel guilt about not feeling guilty about it. So it does exist, but it's sort of like the next level of guilt. And many of the men I work with often get to this point where they feel good about their decision, and then they feel guilty and ashamed because they feel good about the decision to distance themselves from their kids who are behaving so toxically towards them. And by the way, I'm not talking about 4-year-old kids. Okay, I'm talking about kids, the children who are I think below the age of 15 or 16. Do your best to get them into a competent therapist who knows how to handle this stuff. In my opinion, once they hit the age of about 15, 16,
they're set for life.
Yeah, it's going to be much harder to get them into therapy. They've got one foot out the door already. I think the critical time to address this stuff is before the kids hit adolescence. As I said, after about the age of 15, unless the mom is willing to send the kids to therapy and will enforce that.
And of course, if she were a healthy mom, you wouldn't probably need to send them to begin with.
Right.
The thing that you talk about sort of take note of what you said about guilt about not feeling bad about things, or guilt about not feeling guilt. The same thing happens frequently with.
I was raised Catholic, you can tell.
Yeah, the same thing frequently happens with grief. That
Yes.
People will not feel the grief of a loss in a particularly profound way, and sometimes when it is a very profound loss, and not understanding that these things tend to sort themselves through people's psyche in its own way. It's not something that you're supposed to grab a set of feelings and here's feeling A that you're supposed to feel on day 2, and that's the way it works. And people will not feel a deep sense of grief and then end up feeling guilty. And of course, if there's anything interfering with the grief process, it's that guilt. The grief will come.
A good example of that is when there's been a family member, whether it's a child or a parent or a spouse, who, let's say, is like a raging borderline with multiple suicide attempts, who's just dragged the family through hell and back. Oftentimes, when such an individual actually successfully suicides, the family will feel a sense of relief because the nightmare that they've been living has come to an end, which then will often cause guilt about feeling relief that a person who was making your life miserable is no longer there to make you miserable.
So what do you tell when, I know that at times that you work also, not just with men, but with the second wives in these and second girlfriends in these situations, when they are struggling with their husbands or boyfriends, not understanding why they're allowing all this to happen, why they tend to withdraw away from everything and sort of, block everything out and just allow it to happen. And it frustrates them. And I think understandably so, frustrates them. How do you work with them on that? What's the sort of direction you go with that? Because that is also a big problem here.
Well, I encourage them to have boundaries too. I don't give these guys a pass. That they need to have boundaries, they need to have a bottom line, and that they can't do the work for him. And that if he's not on board with getting healthier, learning to stand up for himself, not protecting himself as well as his new partner and family from his abusive ex, which is entirely on him, that it may not get better. It may not work out. And that again, that's not a feel-good answer, but we all have choices to make. And if you don't want to live a life where there's a giant flatulent elephant blowing smelly gas in your living room, and your partner won't help you to kick that smelly flatulent elephant out, there's really not much you can do. And you have to decide, do you want to spend the rest of your life like this? Do you want to spend the next 5 or 10 years like this? Because as I said, even after the children are 18, there's no guarantee that this is going to get any better. Sure, you're not going to have to deal with child support and getting dragged back into family court because mommy wants a raise, and visitation and having kids who are, giving you the cold shoulder or being just aggressively disrespectful to you on the weekends. But the price. But even then, even if you stick it out, I do believe that it causes damage, scar tissue in the relationship that may not go away. Because here's a guy who couldn't stand up to his ex when he was with her, who's allowed that nut to come in and continue to trash him and hurt you and possibly your children. And that's something that I know for a lot of women, it causes them to irrevocably lose respect for the man they love. And that's damaging.
Another thing they should keep in mind, and again, it's not that I would want to discourage any of these women from having boundaries, because it's perfectly appropriate and important to not be with somebody that does not have your back and that doesn't even have
his own back.
Yeah, doesn't even have his own back, and that's appropriate. But keep in mind, and this is where I think sometimes information can be short-sighted and lost, is that when men have work done with them, when they move toward a point, like when they work with Dr. T, that they recognize, I've got to draw this line in the sand and not allow my life to be controlled anymore. That line isn't just with the ex. That's often with the new girlfriend or wife too. That when guys start learning to say, you know what, it's okay for me to have my wants and needs and desires, and it's okay for me to insist that people don't screw with my life or making my own decisions. It's okay for me to insist on being respected. They can't be expected to just point that in the direction that's wanted for the new family. That has to be something that comes out and goes everywhere. So that will include wife number 2 and girlfriend number 2, that they may experience if this guy gets better and really starts taking care of himself and watching his own back, the new wife may experience limits set by him that she is not familiar with. And that's a good thing. That's
not such a bad thing. And honestly, think about it. I mean, I respect people more who have clear limits on what they're going to tolerate and what they won't tolerate. And if the new wife or girlfriend is a healthy, mature, functioning adult, she can roll with that.
And if she's not, she
In fact,
won't roll with it.
she'll probably respect you more. And if she can't roll with that, then you basically you've just changed ownership papers.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you start developing these boundaries and set limits, and you find that the new wife or girlfriend that has been badgering you to do that very thing, and you set them with her and it freaks her out, guess what? You've just married or gotten with your ex-wife again in another relationship, and you probably want to run her off.
Before you have kids with her.
Yes, before, always run off before you breed. You've
Don't
got,
leave hostages behind.
Dr. T always says, don't breed with crazy. It's bad, bad news to breed with crazy.
Not just that, you're creating another generation of this kind of dysfunction.
God, it just occurred to me, I wonder how many guys are walking around out there with double crazy.
I got it. I received an email. I think it was last week. I forgot to tell you about this from a younger guy who I had worked with for a short time, and he sent me an email and said, I was out. I met someone. I thought she was really hot, really nice, and then she started acting this way, and I heard your voice in my head. Don't stick your dick in crazy. He internalized me.
Hey, you know something? If that works for you, just remember, the next time you get tempted to stick your dick in crazy, just imagine Dr. T doing this, and hopefully that will.
Right. No. Is that good judgment or is that bad judgment?
Yes, find yourself a sane woman and have lots of fun sex, but do not stick your dick in crazy. Don't relate to crazy. Don't move her in.
If you do, make sure you are using like as many methods of birth control as is humanly possible.
Use them all.
Triple wrap it.
And better to not get with her, but don't let her hang something in your closet. Don't let her leave an earring behind. Don't let her bring her earrings in to begin with. But of course, that's like saying, go to the moon tomorrow for a vacation to a lot of guys. Telling them, because guys do love crazy women, because you know what they say about crazy sex.
Crazy in bed. Unfortunately, once you have kids, it's the party's over.
You're dead.
The party's over once kids become involved, because then when you decide you finally had enough of that, it becomes much more difficult to break away. So let's see, any other guilt topics?
I think I'm guilted out. I've reached the guilt bottom. I'm tired of guilt.
But maybe let's do this. I know guilt. It's like I work through my guilt stuff, except for my guilt about no longer feeling guilt. But I'm working on
feel guilt about not feeling guilt, and I don't feel guilt about either one of those things.
You're further in than me. But I think what would be helpful for a lot of guys who are struggling with feelings of guilt is to do some reality testing around that. Okay? So guilt is a human emotion, just like happiness, joy, sadness, and guilt, we're supposed to feel guilt when we have done something wrong. Okay? When we have wronged another person or acted in a way that is incongruent with our values and our sense of integrity. So when you're choking on your guilt regarding your children, reality test with yourself. Have a conversation with yourself. Have you done anything wrong? Is making the decision that you don't want to be in an unhealthy, toxic, and abusive relationship something to be ashamed of? No, it is not. Is that a decision to feel guilty about? No, it is not. Is making the decision that you are no longer going to tolerate disrespect from your children, abusive behaviors from your children, something to feel guilty about? No, it is not.
And guilt will pass. I mean, one of the things that you can always count on is if you, once you decide the relationship's abusive, toxic to you, and that it's not going to get better, then if you feel guilty, if even analyzing it, if picking it apart and looking at it and saying, hey, this is nothing to feel guilty about, you still feel guilty, leave anyway. And you can take your guilt with you, and it'll last for a little while, and then you'll get past it. But the longer you stay in that, the worse it'll get.
I think where the guilt is coming from, because oftentimes the guys I work with, and I'll take them through that kind of, reasoning test. Intellectually, they get it. The guilt comes from not being able to live up to the ex's or the children's often incredibly unrealistic and self-serving expectations for these men. And if your ex-wife expects you to not move on with your life, to live to serve at a moment's notice, her needs, the children's needs, which are oftentimes about her needs, then that is not a reasonable expectation. Okay, that is self-serving for her. It's to her benefit. That is not a healthy, bears repeating, reasonable expectation for her to have. So don't feel a sense of guilt for not living up to that, or consciously choosing not to meet those expectations.
I think there's as Dr. T pointed out, guilt has a reason. It has an absolute reason. It's there to tell us when we're operating outside of our values and beliefs. That's what guilt is for. It's sort of like a moral rudder in life. It keeps us on course and keeps us from violating what we believe to be important in life. And so it's a really, I think, a very good, healthy human emotion that's important to have. Now, after having had worked through some of this stuff in life, what I would feel guilty about is not taking care of myself. Mm-hmm. What I would feel guilty about now is not the same thing I would feel guilty about 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, I would feel guilty for taking care of myself. That's childhood programming. That's being raised by people that tell you that you're selfish or that you're supposed to be taking care of them. And that's what, we say dysfunctional families. That's most of us. We get raised with messages to feel guilty if we do what's right for ourselves. No matter how hard parents try, they somehow manage to impart that message, take care of me, to their children. And it's something as we individuate as adults that we are supposed to grow past. And most people do eventually, I think. But if you want to feel guilty about something, consider what you're tolerating and what you're tolerating from your children, what you're tolerating from your ex-wife, the disrespect that you're putting up with, and consider how you're hiding behind keeping the peace and hiding behind a connection to your kids, which is what you're doing. I mean, let's be honest about that. You're doing all manner of rationalization just not to face the fact that you don't know how to stand up and say no when the time calls for it. If you want to feel guilty about something, feel guilty about that, because that might drive you toward making a more healthy decision. But feeling guilty for walking out the door, that's just old dysfunctional programming from somewhere. It has nothing to do with living a healthy life, and it has nothing to do with how moral you are or whether or not you're a good person. Staying where you're being abused does not make you good. It makes you weak, and it makes you not a person who respects themselves. And you're never going to get away from that.
That's right. And a few weeks ago, I can't remember the topic of the show, but we talked about how people oftentimes, the values that they believe they have are not actually their own values. They are what their parents have handed down to them. And oftentimes, these things that you consider values are a recipe to get into abusive, unhealthy relationships. Like, it is my job to make sure my partner is happy. It is my job to fulfill all of my partner's needs. Now, if you're with a healthy person, that doesn't necessarily need to be a problem. But if you get mixed up with a high conflict person, an emotionally immature, selfish, or personality disordered person, an abusive person, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. And it is not your job to make other people happy. It is your job to treat people with respect and consideration as they afford it to you. And it is your job to take care of yourself. And if you are allowing yourself to be abused and manipulated into feeling guilty and responsible for things that are not your responsibility, then you are going to continue to be a slave to the mercurial, volatile, emotional whims of an asshole.
That's worth feeling guilty about. It is. It's worth feeling guilt for that. I don't know what there is in life outside what you've got. As far as I know, any certainty, you've only got one shot at this. This is the one life that you've got. And do you want to wait till your kids are 18 in a fantasy, believing that you're really waiting till they're 18 so you can have a life then, so you can avoid looking at the fact that you're really saying, I'm choosing not to have a life now because standing up for myself is too hard. Not my call, but I wouldn't want to live that way. I just wouldn't.
Well, and guys, I think you're going to be amazed. I mean, this can be scary. This is sort of like throwing out possibly all of your early childhood programming. You may lose certain relationships. But again, if the relationship was contingent upon you being taken advantage of and exploited and treated like garbage, that relationship is not a loss. But once you're able to do that and you treat yourself with respect and you put yourself first, and I don't mean in an egomaniacal, personality disordered way, but put yourself first in that you're not going to tolerate crap from others. The quality of people that you are attracted to and that you attract to yourself is going to change. You know, there's a saying, water seeks its own level. And if you're a doormat who's willing to tolerate abuse, that's what you're going to get. When you decide that you are no longer going to allow people like that into your life, as Paul said earlier, you know, that crazy is sort of that microbe that gets into the water system and spreads. This is the antidote for that. This is how you bring health and positivity into your life and into your relationships. Because I tell you what, healthy people who have boundaries, healthy women, healthy men, they don't want to be next to that kind of toxicity. And if you allow that kind of toxicity to fester in your life, and healthy people can see that kind of chaos and dysfunction, they're not going to want to be a part of that.
They're not going to be looking at the dysfunction like it's a part of something you're dealing with. They're going to look at the dysfunction like it's you, and it will be. At any rate, we are running right at our time, which is good. Dr. T, is there any final thoughts that you want to add to this discussion before we?
Just what I've been ending with the last couple of weeks. We are at October 1st, which is the kickoff of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Every day this month, I will be publishing a story on both Shrink for Men and A Voice for Men. From somebody who might be out there watching this about your experience being in a relationship with an abusive woman. There is a post on both sites that has submission guidelines. If you'd like to share your story, please take a look at that, follow the guidelines, use paragraph breaks, and send me a document. Paragraph breaks are good. That's my boundary.
Spell check is also good.
Spell check is very good.
Yes, blocks, paragraphs that are 4,000 words long, very bad. Eye killers. Nobody wants to edit that. So paragraphs are really good.
Yeah, paragraph breaks, fabulous.
And let me have a closing. Let me say 2 words. October 6th. Why does Paul say October 6th, you say? Well, I'll tell you what. That's the day I'm going to shut up and quit asking you for money. That's the day that our current fundraiser ends. We're in our quarterly fundraiser at avoiceformen.com. And if you like the programming that we're providing, the articles, the information, and the activism conferences, and all radio shows and everything that we do, you can really help us continue bringing that to you by going to avoiceformen.com or to this channel page where there is a little tab up there for tip jar and tossing some change in there. We could really use it. There's a lot we have to do and a lot we want to do. Also might suggest that you wander over to shrinkformen.com. There is a donation button there, and Dr. T does an awful lot of work. She does have paid services available, but that is not the only thing that she does, including, if you can imagine, editing out and presenting 31 articles in 31 days and all the other things she's done to support the work that we do at A Voice for Men and to support men in the community that are dealing with abusive wives. There are and abusive ex-wives, because you can divorce her, but divorcing her abuse is a different story entirely. She has a very low-cost forum available on her website. Support. I'm sorry?
There is no fee to join my forum.
Oh, well, like I said, it's very low cost. You can wander in there for free.
Well, no, I mean, I was considering doing a subscription fee because I wanted to pay my moderators something, but the reality is a lot of the guys on there are currently in abusive relationships, and their wives go through their PayPal credit card bills, and if they saw something billed to Shrink for Men, not good. So for that reason, I've kept it free, because it would prohibit men who need the services from getting them.
Yeah, and that's why every time I have one of those people, one of those ideological people say, well, why don't you just go build 20 or 30 battered shelters for men? Sure. Yeah, we'll just raise it from the guys that are currently living in their cars. Really nice. No, if you think you are or might be in a destructive, abusive relationship, please visit shrinkformen.com. Visit the forums there. And you can also consider Dr. T's private fee services that are available. If you're disinterested in men's rights issues in general, please come and visit avoiceformen.com. We ask you also, we're begging for everything. If you will, please, if you like this programming, please sub to this channel, pass it along to somebody else, and visit us on Google Plus and follow us there. ABF, A Voice for Men Facebook page is also available. Twitter, we got all that social media crap.
I'll send you a PBS tote bag.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, no tote bags. Just good programming. And anyway, thank you, everybody, for showing up. And we'll see you next week for sure for another episode of Going Mental.